Thank you, Heather, and thank you for having me once again through the Aberystwyth network of Celtic Studies. Let me share once again. Here we are. So, well, as Heather said, I've been working for the past 3 years on Joseph Loth, so I will try to make it restrained for now. But one of my main issues with this subject was that I followed at the University of Western Brittany the Breton language bachelor, and then I followed as well the Breton master, and then somehow I had never heard of Joseph Loth in details. I just had heard his name in passing, but I didn't know who he was at all, which, as you will see, is considering some of his achievements really striking. So he published his first thesis in 1883 regarding the origin of Breton language. And while that thesis is now, well, since at least the 1950s, it has been overlooked because, well, it has been, how should I say that? Well, scientifically speaking, it's not up to date. And as science goes, we now have a more detailed and precise approach to it. But it was still fairly significant for 70 years. So that is something in the history of Celtic studies that was a cultural element of significance. Then, perhaps more importantly for Breton studies, he created the first university department of Breton studies in the faculty of Rennes. And in the same movement, he made this faculty finance the first journal of Breton studies, Annales de Bretagne, which is still running to this day. And while we are in Rennes, he was also the dean of said faculty of letters for 15 years, which is just in the context of Breton universities, fairly significant as well. For the Welsh audience here, he was the first to translate the Mabinogi in French from the Welsh text, something that I will come back to a bit later in this talk. His rise in the university milieu of the Third Republic was also happened at the same time that the Breton movement was structuring itself in more significant ways than it was before, which is why I put 1818, Clévretic Brovraes, which is the creation of the first Breton regionalist union with the specific goal to protect and promote Brittany / Breton, the Breton language. It also happened at a time where he was putting Celtic languages in a Breton university, stating that it had, if not a significance, at least an importance and a right to be known and learned. Whereas in 1902, the government published the law that forbade the priests to preach in the Breton language, which, as a consequence, was also the year when the first Breton nationalist text was published, which we will also see a bit later in this presentation. Oh, wait. Lastly, he finished his fairly prestigious career at the Collège de France in Paris, which is the highest institution for someone who works at the university one can reach in the French system. And since he was moving in Paris following the death of Henri d'Arbois de Jubainville, he also took over the direction of Revue Celtique, which he was the head of until his death in 1934. Another significant detail about Joseph Loth's life was that he was born in Lower Brittany, which is this side, the western side of it, which is how we usually call the Breton-speaking parts of Brittany, which is a first for a linguist interested in the Breton language or the Breton grammar, generally speaking. And he was the first, and he was, until after the Second War, almost the only one who had been raised in Breton. For to be precise, he was born in Guémené-sur-Scorff, which is right here, if you can see my little thing. So we have someone here who achieved great university success, published a lot, was not only recognized as a Breton specialist, but acknowledged by the institution for his competence, not once, not twice, but for the entirety of his career. Not only that, but he as a professor, he also taught, he taught the professors who taught my professors. So there's a direct lineage here that can be followed through the century. And as I said, he was also a native Breton speaker. All of these things seem to point out that he's a very legitimate person in the Breton history to know about. And yet, not only did I not hear about it, but as you would know, it's very common to name streets after, well, people of interest. And in the entirety of Brittany, for instance, there's only 4 or 5 streets named after him, and they're very insignificant streets. So there is really no light shed about him. And in my opinion, that begins, well, we can understand that right when he died. So when he died in 1934, we see a lot of reaction because he was still a figure of authority and well-known in the country. But if we focus on the comments made by the people of the Breton, by the press of the Breton movement, then things start to become clearer. In the Die Hunum journal, which was from the same region as he was, they wrote, on the first day of April, Mr. Joseph Loth passed away. Mr. Loth was the most learned man in the world regarding Breton. He often helped us at Die Hunum and gave us the wisest advices. That was on the very first issue that followed his death. But in the next issue, which is something that fairly clear on where they stood in regard to his legacy, they published a 6-page article based only of memories of him and anecdotes of their relationship with him. And a huge part of it was also biographical. So they really put the emphasis on his figure and how important he was for the journal and for the Breton movement, according to them. Another important journal in the Breton language, Fils Abrès, wrote that his books are a treasure for Breton people, but a treasure, sadly, which has been overlooked. This is one of the many sentences of the 3-page article that they published about him. So once again, we have a journal that acknowledged the importance of Joseph Loth. However, this very sentence, which is about someone who, once again, was until a few weeks ago a professor at the Collège de France, really makes you wonder about who exactly has overlooked his work, because clearly, professionally speaking, he was not overlooked. A more nationalist paper, Chatel, dedicated its front page and the next one to Joseph Loth, stating he was a great Breton. The article on the left is about the stakes and the fate of his Breton work. The one on the right is written by one of his former students in Rennes, stating he was the Bretonest of our masters. And there are two other articles about the funeral and who was there, who wasn't, etc. So one of the main journals of the nationalist movement clearly acknowledged him as well as a grand figure for the movement. But not everyone agreed. In the Wallon journal, which is a literary journal, so it's slightly different purpose, but still with the optic of making literature for the future elite of the Breton state to come. They wrote, Mr. Loth was one of the most learned men of our times regarding Celtic languages, and more interestingly, his works, despite being written in French, have meant and will mean a lot for those who fight for Brittany. Despite being written in French, which clearly states that that is an issue with his work, and more precise, the level of, I would say, disdain for these French written works is that those two sentences are the only thing they published about him. That is it. They didn't publish any other paper or biographical details. That is the only comment they had to make about Joseph Loth's death and general career. So we have already a voice of dissension in his legacy. The next month saw the first publication of the journal Stur, which, well, in its content is even more radical on the right, and, well, took the chance perhaps to differentiate themselves from Brézatao, perhaps because the anonymous writer had his own kind of reproach to make to Joseph Loth, to publish a page, well, establishing their position on the Joseph Loth case. And so the anonymous writer wrote, Joseph Loth is dead. The newspaper said he was a great Breton. He had no sympathy for Brézatao, something that, well, apparently Brézatao didn't hold up against him, but this is an issue here. And then they mention a, well, little anecdote that from the first case didn't seem very significant, but here it is. In 1929, when 3 Bretons were in Alsace to join forces with the autonomists, Joseph Loth stabbed them in the back by sending his famous letter to the Colmar jurors, in which he assumed the right to speak on behalf of Brittany to deny the existence of Breton nationality. Joseph Loth may have been a great Breton, he was not a good Breton. Now, well, things have been said in this paper, and I would like to, well, dive a little deeper on this Alsace affair, because what happened was that in 1928, there was a meeting of Alsatian autonomists that was repressed by the state. Namely, they sent the police there to arrest both the leaders of the party as well as regular militants. And the whole thing went into the press because there was also, at their gathering, there had also been the presence of French nationalists who were obviously against Alsatian autonomists. And in the Joseph Loth, so in solidarity to that, some people from the Breton movement sent a letter to for the trial of those autonomists, saying, well, we understand that because we want, well, we're also fighting with the state, and we understand the kind of motivation that should cause this situation. And in response to that, Joseph Loth sent his own letters, which he also sent to the entirety of the Breton press in French and in Breton. And in that letter, he mostly said that people from the Breton movement should not be taken as the majority of the Breton people. And while using the rhetoric of the 250,000 Bretons who had supposedly died during the First World War, he explained that since the Breton people died for that war, which goal was to bring the Alsace and Lorraine back into France, obviously they wouldn't understand why Alsace would live now and would not support such a movement. Now, this would already be annoying to the nationalist of Sture, but there is a small paragraph in his letter that definitely is the cause for his dismissal. Here is when he wrote, "As for the famous College of Bards or Poets," which was the ones who had written to the jurors, "it has no influence whatsoever in the country. The bards or poets of the Breton language, more or less interested in the knowledge of this language, engage annually with the hilarious druids dressed in carnival costumes in grotesque ceremonies that only they seem to take seriously, along with a few proselytes of incomparable naivety." That, for obvious reason, from the nationalist Breton movement would not go by well. I will spare you the detail because it had no direct consequence to what we're talking about, but the Gourses Braise did retaliate with a letter of its own signed from the hilarious druids stating that Joseph Loth was a bit out of his league regarding Breton nationalism and the Breton cause, and that he shouldn't be talking about such topic. Nevertheless, this happening in 1929, where the Breton nationalist movement is on its ascending wave, so to speak, also tells us how disconnected Joseph Loth is from this movement. For instance, a few years later, in 1931, he addressed this letter. Well, he addressed this letter to Francis Gourville, who was at the time close enough with the nationalist movement, and also a journalist who published regular papers in Breton in the French-speaking press, in which he wrote a German journal that apparently deals with the Neo-Breton Renaissance. See the interrogation mark that really signifies he's not really sure what he's talking about there. Mentions Mordrel as one of our outstanding writers. I have read something by him, but I cannot remember it at all. What's his best work, and could you obtain it for me, naturally sending me the price? Now, Joseph Loth asking in 31 who Mordrel, which is Ollier Mordrel, a leader, one of the leaders of the National Movement Party, founder of the Goualan Journal, which Loth reads and has written reviews for the Revue Celtique, states that, well, not only the ideas, as we've seen previously, of the Breton nationalism are a bit far from him, but also he doesn't seem to know who's part of it and who are its leaders. So this was in July 31. In August 32, in Rennes was the statue celebrating the union of Brittany to France, bombed by a group of nationalists, of Breton nationalists that Mordrel wasn't a part of, but still, well, knew since there were only a few of them. One of the early nationalist writers, wrote to someone who was at the time working at the National Library in Aberystwyth, a big surprise this morning from l'Ouest Éclair, which is the journal. The monument in Rennes has been bombed and destroyed. Who could have done this madness, which can only harm the Breton movement? So, regardless of who did it, it does strike conversation, because even in the same, even among the nationalists, this doesn't, it's not a neutral action. They don't all agree with it. And so, because it was such a big terrorist attack, if you will, this also was displayed on the national press, and in the Petit Journal in Paris, it also made the front page, because it was such an unusual thing to happen in the context of relationship between the regions and the state, the regions and Paris. This was a fairly new type of action for those specific motivations. Yves Berthoud, who is the one surprised by the news, was a close relationship to Loth. At least, I don't know if they were friends, but I know that they knew each other for a very long time. And during the First World War, they would go to eat at each other's place in Paris, which is at least a sign that they did get along. He was the writer of the first Breton nationalist pamphlet in 1903, which I put one of the most significant part here, where he stated that more than any other country, ours has strayed from its path. Its language is expelled from school, fought by the savage schoolmasters of government who are paid by the enemy to work for him. But the Celts are a solid people. In Brittany, there are still 1,500,000 Breton, a good half of the population who speak the Celtic language. So, well, I don't know exactly what kind of conversation Yves Berthaud talking about savage schoolmasters of government with Joseph Loth, a professor of said government, would have talked about, and how they would have talked about it. But at least there is an effective closeness in their relationship that indicates that it's not, Loth isn't disconnected from the Breton nationalist of the 1930s because he's too far in terms of who he knows and who he doesn't. There really is perhaps a more generational gap than just a problem of ideas. And even though, so this bombing in Rennes happened the next year, he still wasn't sure of who Mordrel was, because he wrote to Yves Le Diberder, writer in Breizatau and Die Hunam, asking about this Mordrel. Now, I don't have lots question, but we have Yves Le Diberder's answer, where he explains everything about who Olia Mordrel is. In your letter, you mentioned a note in the Zeitschrift, which is the Zeitschrift für Keltische Philologie, describing Mordrel as one of the best Breton writers. So once again, we know that it's another German journal that states that Mordrel is a great Breton writer. And specifically, what has been published in 1933 in the Zeitschrift is a translation by Olia Mordrel of one of Rainer Maria Rilke's poem in Breton. So that's what they're discussing. You are going to force me to reveal some secrets. Now, I had for time reason, I had to cut out what the secrets are. So I'll tell you shortly. It's according to Diberder, it's not Mordrel who did the translation. That's the big secret, supposedly. But Le Diberder has been known to sometimes twist the facts a bit. So I don't know how much weight we should give to that information. But then he explains Mordrel's sociological background, explaining that Mordrel is a Gallo from the Hede or Plunia area, son of General Mordrel, grandson of a Corsican mother. There would be no shame for Mordrel, a Gallo bourgeois, in having an imperfect mastery of Breton. But this character, currently an architect in Quimper, married to someone from Douarnenez of Breton-speaking origin, I believe, this character, who is at once estimable, quite likable, and unbearable, is the soul or one of the souls of Breton autonomism. And that is why it is in his interest to make people believe and to let them believe that he is brilliant in Breton. So now, like I told you that Joseph Loth was had the specificity of being of being the first and one of the few at the time was both a Breton specialist and a native Breton speaker. And this is clearly what is at play here, that Aurélien Mordrel presenting himself as the leader of the fight for a Breton state needs to prove and to have the image of an excellent Breton speaker to add to his legitimacy, to be more legitimate. And that is in 33. So not quite a little less than a year before Loth's death. So we have someone who, even at the very last years of his life, which he spent being interested and studying Breton text and taking part in a certain measure to the Breton, maybe not revival, but at least the Breton publishing world, being teaching to the next Breton-speaking generation of scholars, and who is completely disconnected of what is technically the vanguard of Breton politics at the time, which perhaps explain why those journals dismissed him as not being a grand Breton. All right, so in regard to his connection as a professor, here you have, well, lots of meaningful actors of the Breton intellectual life of the 20th century, but I will just focus on Yves Le Diberder on the right, who is the one who explained to Loth who Mordrel was, who was writing in Breizatau. One of the papers in the Breizatau Joseph Loth special issues was written by him. Also from the Van region from where Joseph Loth was. And here you have François Vallée, who was a grammarian, who taught himself and then attended Joseph Loth's classes in Rennes, who apparently learned either from Joseph Loth or taught himself Welsh, and was very involved with the Gualan movement, who dismissed Loth and who would rather, whenever possible, whenever they had the choice, they would rather go with François Vallée's analysis rather than Joseph Loth. But still, it's still through his influence that this is possible to an extent. So he's not, it's only a few person away, seemingly. And now I invite you to my world of connecting the dots. So here you have a map based off the Prelib database, which is powered by the CRBC in Brest, and which goals is to analyze and understand better the Breton literary milieu. And when I tried to understand why there was such a gap between the nationalist movement and Joseph Loth, I compared Ropar-Simon, who was the head of the Gualan journal and one of the leading figures of the Breton nationalist movement, especially in terms of literature, translating a lot of the world's finest literature, if you will, into Breton, to Joseph Loth's one. And you see that, on the website you could zoom, but there's only so much I can do from a screenshot. So here we have the little red dot Ropar-Simon. The green dots are journals. The blue dots, the dark blue dots, are publishers. That is to say, see here, all the little white dots connected here are people who have published a book through this publisher specifically. And here, all the little white dots have published at least an article in this journal here. And what we have, if you compare the two, it's fairly clear that they have two almost completely different social networks. That, if you will, Ropar-Simon here has one that is very restricted, very close to him. And you have to believe my words. But what this means, if we could zoom here, is that a lot of the people here, it's actually the same people working in all these various journals, which is why it makes it so close to him. It's a very, let's say, it's about 150 people, all working in different journals, but contributing to the same publishers, to the same journals, to the same association, making it a very tight and dense network, whereas Joseph Loth is much more spread out. It's a lot wider because he's connected to more international journals like the Zeitschrift für Keltische Philologie and Revue Celtique. So there are lots of various people who have published there and who never took an interest in Brittany. So that's a lot of non-connected people, who are not connected to the Breton side of his network. And in the same way, he's also connected to the French institution, but say at the Collège de France, most people are not related either to Celtic studies, nor to Breton literature. So there are various institutions that are much more diverse in the people that take part in them. So we have someone who's who's at the core really of Breton literature and Breton-oriented politics versus someone who's clearly more international for one, and also more institutional, which just draws him further, draws them further from each other. This distance also manifests itself in the translation of the Mabinogi. So one of the stakes for Joseph Loth in 1989, when he published the Mabinogi from the Welsh text, was that it had not been done in French, and also, as you see, there was already a French Mabinogi, but Joseph Loth tells us that Théodore Herzog de la Villemarqué based his translation of Charlotte Guest's English one. Charlotte Guest, who omitted some bits of the Mabinogi, and La Villemarqué, who apparently did not understand all the English in Guest's translation. So there's those technicalities, and there's another reason is that providing a scientific translation of the Mabinogi with a critical introduction and explanation of the text, of the context, is also, well, was also a way to take this text of La Villemarqué legacy of invented tradition and putting it in the realm of science and, well, legitimate knowledge, if you will. And, well, 30 years later, or 40 years later, the Breton movement did the same to him by translating the Mabinogi into Breton from the original Welsh as well. But they did, well, Fanchelies did the work over the span of 3 years of translating the Mabinogi completely into Breton, knowing that the entirety of Gualan's readers were also French speakers, so they were likely to have been able to read them in the Loth translation. But there is, well, Wales is the heart of Celticity, and whoever has the authority on Welsh matter is also the authority on the Celtic nature of Brittany. A fact that was really sought after in between the wars. And now to, well, the conclusion for now, and at least some keys perhaps to think about how the legacy and the memory of the early Celtic studies in France has not been, well, interesting enough for the Breton nationalist movement to be passed on and reach us. I'd like to make a little comparison between Joseph Loth and Jean-Pierre Calor, who, for those who don't know him, was a Breton poet. He wrote, well, his most famous poem for now is Mes organes écrits à mort, which has been put into music after his death and is, as far as it goes in Breton music, a hit, I would say. It's one of the first songs you learn when you learn Breton. It's a very popular one in the Breton-speaking milieu. And so he was acknowledged as a great poet during his life, which was, as you can see, fairly short because he died in the trenches. And he was acknowledged as a great poet in the Breton literary milieu, but also some of his poems had been translated into the French press and were seen as very good by French poets themselves. So really someone with, well, a legitimate competence and talent for what he did, but who was, according to Sébastien Carnet, also dismissed and considered as a traitor for being too prone to slide to the French nationalism once the war had started, which can be compared with how Joseph Loth, who was well integrated into the French institution and also had fought in his youth in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870. So you have two Breton writers acknowledged by their peers who both fought for France and who both, well, in the case of Joseph Loth, never held a public reproach to the French state, well, putting that into question, putting the war into question. Even during the First World War, he's just, whenever he comments the war itself, it's never through the lens of anti-militarism or anti-French state. It's really just, well, soldiers have to fight and France has to win, and that is it. And he is even known to have made some comments about, I don't remember who he is, but who was not important a professor position at the Aberystwyth University because he was a conscious objector during the war, and stating that this was not an honest position to have during the war. So someone who fought for France and didn't question it, and Jean-Pierre Callot, who also fought for France and had the audacity of being pro-French for the time he was fighting, and since he died, didn't have the chance to well, discuss that further. And for Sébastien Carnet, there is also something that is not quite a detail in that Jean-Pierre Callot was from the Vannes region, just like Joseph Loth, and for Mordrel and the other nationalists, this dialect of Breton was to be erased and merged into a unified Breton language that would be the same all across Brittany. And the will of Jean-Pierre Callot and the Die Hunem journal to consistently keep writing in the Van dialect way of writing, which is a bit, well, it's a bit different from the what's the majority now. They consistently use it in the journal, in the books they publish. Everything is written this way. And Mordrel has written himself a few articles about how they should stop trying to be, to sound Vante and instead try to be the less Vante as possible. Because, well, this difference was an obstacle for the Breton Union, according to him. And this vision of Jean-Pierre Callot, seen as a traitor, as someone who failed Brittany, is perhaps well described by Hunolier in the 1950s, so 40 years after his death, where he wrote, however, he has not been a national hero. Let's take him for what he was, a great poet, a great heart, though weak in many aspects. Which draws us back to Joseph Loth being either a Grand Breton or not a Grand Breton, a good Breton or not being a good Breton. This is what the Breton nationalist movement was struggling with those figures that took Brittany as an object, whether a literary one or a scientific one, and pushed it so that the audience clearly was also outside of Brittany and outside of the Breton movement, and how to deal with figures they could not entirely, whose figure they couldn't entirely control the image. And so far, my work on Joseph Loth is the first one, if you exclude 2 papers written in the 70s. But he's not the only one in his situation. Georges Dautin, Henri Darbois de Chupinville, all these people are waiting to be studied, both for their work and their relationship with the Breton movement, which was alive and reading their works as they were published. Whereas Théodore Arcin de la Villemarqué, despite, in addition to countless articles written about his work, has 3 entire PhD theses written about his work. Ropar-Simon has 2. Ollier-Mordrel has at least 1, and very heavy master degrees have been obtained by studying those figures, those important figures of the Breton political movement, but also figures that had been deemed important by the Breton movement. On the other side, you have someone like Joseph Loth, who was pushed away in silence by Gualin and Sture, and just never looked at after for 80 years, 75 years, which is why very likely I was not taught about him until I had finished my master. Thank you.